India has successfully hosted the G20, from a Delhi Declaration to this new economic corridor between India, the Middle East, and Europe. There has been a whole host of announcements, but to try and assess what has been achieved and what remains to be seen, I'm now joined by a very special guest here at the offices of CNN News 18. Chris Helms is the spokesperson for the US Embassy. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you for having me, Zakir.
So let's start off with the G20. It was a big sort of moment in the sun for India as the host, and of course ably partnered by countries like the United States. What do you make of the Delhi Declaration? Because even 12 hours before it got formally adopted, those of us covering the event were not sure that the declaration would actually get adopted.
So the declaration represents the culmination of a year of great meetings by India. India, as the host of the G20, did a fantastic job across the country. Not just the summit, but there were 4 working group meetings for each ministerial before the summit. So this was substantive. The declaration shows the breadth of the discussions that were undertaken during the meetings, and it shows that the G20 is the premier international economic forum, and we were happy to be here and pleased with the success that India had as host.
So specifically on the part in the declaration which deals with the Russia-Ukraine war, there has been some criticism, I think Ukraine has said this on record, that they believe the language was diluted. What would you say to that?
I'd say that the G20, every single member of the G20 reached consensus in favor of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and specifically on Ukraine. So the declaration itself represents a clear statement from the world community, from the 20 most powerful economies, that we must respect territorial integrity and sovereignty, something that I know is very important here in India. And so we were happy that this was a consensus-based agreement and one that every single member signed up for.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the role played by US government officials in helping achieve the Delhi Declaration?
I can't give you anything that was happening behind the scenes, but our Sherpas were hard at work, not just the day or two before, but for weeks. And so this was a statement that was hammered out over a long period of time and builds on all of the ministerials that led up to the summit.
One of the big announcements that happened on the sidelines of the G20 summit was this economic corridor between India, the Middle East, Europe, of course, backed by the United States. Many are saying that this is perhaps the biggest and most direct challenge to the Belt and Road that China has initiated more than 10 years ago. What would you say to that?
I'd say this isn't about one particular country, but it is about a number of countries that came together on this, through India, the Middle East, and Europe. We're talking about a large swath of the region that's going to be connected through ports, through rails, and then through digital technology and energy over that. This economic corridor is layering economic opportunities. And what it's doing is it represents something that Secretary Blinken talked about last week on US foreign policy, that we are weaving together our partners. The United States right now, through our diplomacy, is actively working to strengthen our partnerships and then weave them together. And this is a fantastic example of how we're weaving together a number of different partners to deliver results for the region.
Is there anything you can tell us about how it's going to be financed? Because there are questions being asked about, who's going to put in the money, and in any case, such heavy-duty infrastructure projects, corridors, etc., are very investment-heavy. So how is that going to work out?
So this builds on the Blue Dot Network, which was a G7 initiative on transparency in financing. And so the details still need to be worked out. What we signed at the G20 summit was a memorandum of understanding. So our teams will get together in the next month or two to sort through the details. But the most important thing about the financing is that it will be transparent. The citizens of the countries that are involved in this, the ones that it affects the most, they're going to be able to see the terms. They're going to be able to see transparently what debt are their countries signing up for. And that's what's important about this financing, is that the infrastructure is clear and transparent for the members.
So we also had the bilateral between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi just before the official G20 began. And they were taking stock essentially of the decisions made at the state visit, whether it's the jet engine deal or the Predators. Is there an update you can share with us on that?
I think it's exactly what you just said, that this was building on the Prime Minister's visit to Washington for the state visit. We had a huge joint statement that came out of that, dozens of paragraphs, and even just a few months later, we had another joint statement with plenty of substance to add on to that. Beyond just building on what was already mentioned, we announced new financing through our Development Finance Corporation for solar power and other activities. We announced an agreement between the IITs and the American Association of Universities. So we're finding ways, even beyond what happened at the state visit, for our countries to come together across a range of issues through our governments, through our people, through education, health, and other initiatives.
So talking about the G20 was the inclusion of the African Union, negotiators. I spoke to Jay Shankar, I spoke to some of the others in the negotiating team. They were also talking about how the emerging countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, they played a role in trying to get a consensus. How do you see the G20 becoming this, not just the voice of the global elite, but a more representative organization?
Absolutely. Thanks to India's leadership, the G20 delivered for the developing world. You saw the economic corridor that we just mentioned that is spanning across regions, but one of the other things that we discussed was how to build bigger, better, more efficient international financial organizations. So one of the big ones is the World Bank, now headed by the first Indian American, Ajay Banga. He was there with India, the United States, Brazil, and South Africa as the future leaders of the G20 to talk about the central role that financial institutions play in helping the developing world further get access to finance and develop.
All right. One of the things that happened on the sidelines was when the Chinese president decided to skip the Delhi G20. Was seen as a bit of a snub to the host nation. Do you think through the course of those 2 days in Delhi, world leaders came together to make some pretty important decisions and announcements, and China, for whatever reason it chose to, at least at the leadership level, if they're not part of the room, then they're lost. Do you believe that that message has gone out?
Absolutely. I can't speak to China why they didn't send their leader, but I know that those that did show up, the United States showed up. Those that did show up at the premier International Economic Forum delivered for their people. India, as the host, brought a lot of new excitement and energy to the process this entire year. The announcements, as you mentioned, with the African Union, it demonstrates that the world can come together, and we are delivering results for our people. So I can't speak for the Chinese government why they sat out, but those that showed up, the leaders of the G20, delivered for our people.
So all this talk of people saying that you're going to have the US and its partners in one corner and Russia and China in the other corner, and there's going to be this great power competition, new Cold War, call it what you want. You don't see that happening. The Delhi G20 has sort of reversed that to some extent?
Well, what I saw is, as you mentioned, the Delhi statement, it was signed by all 20 members. Everyone was participating for the entire year, but the leadership was those who showed up. The leadership was the United States, the leadership was India, and so I don't see the world moving on from this premier economic forum. What I do see is our governments coming together, and as I said, weaving partnerships together. The economic corridor you mentioned was not a Western or a global South agreement. It was India, the Middle East, Europe, the United States, a large swath of the world coming together through the G20 with India as host.
All right, so you were talking about leadership, and I do want to ask you this, and I know you refrain generally from commenting about domestic politics, but one of the leading candidates in the Republican race, Vivek Ramaswamy, there's a lot of interest in him here because of his Indian roots and so on. He's made an announcement about sort of revamping the H-1B visa program, and I want to know if you have any thoughts on that, any response to it.
Yeah, I mean, two things. One, his candidacy and the interest that Americans have in him, Nikki Haley, it shows the rising power of Indian Americans in the United States. And so there is increasing interest and respect for the power of the Indian American community in elections. On this specific proposal, anything that would happen to the H-1B program would happen through Congress. It's part of our Immigration and Naturalization Act, and so he's welcome to propose whatever he would like as a candidate. Ultimately, any changes that happen to our immigration law would come through Congress.
All right, and final word, since you're here, where are we on visa processing times? Is it better than what it used to be before?
So
it's not 800 days anymore.
Well, what I can tell you is that we are working to meet the demand as best we can. We are finally at full strength. We have more visa officers today than we did pre-pandemic. We set a goal for ourselves this year of 1 million visas. We already passed 900,000. You're likely to see us hit 1 million in the next week or two. And so we're going to set new records for visas. We are bringing more officers out here, and we're setting records for the most visas ever given at the mission out here in India.
All right, thank you very much, Chris, for making the journey all the way to our offices.
No, thank you for having me, Zach. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, there you have it, the US Embassy spokesperson, Chris Elms, giving us his thoughts on the G20 and why the Delhi G20 and how the Delhi Declaration was brought about.